Welcome to the In Spirit podcast from Amoris Christi. Join us as we explore current events and all manner of fascinating topics and explore their connections to Christian living.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the In Spirit podcast. We are such a privilege today. We are honored by the presence of Br.Emile of the Taizé community. Taizé community is in France, and we're just coming off a beautiful weekend here in Delray Beach, Florida, called Together Opening Paths of Hope, and where we're praying with the songs of Taizé and having times of sharing and reflections. And so we're blessed by the presence of Br.Emile of Taizé, philosopher, theologian, scriptures. We were blessed with so much of the richness during this weekend. And so it's such a joy for us to have him during this interview. And we thought of talking a little bit about the topic of polarization, a topic that's very evident, not just in the church, but also very much in the world today in the United States. So, brother, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you.
Welcome, brother.
Thanks, Chris.
And maybe just for our audience who's listening, they might have heard the word Taizé before, and for many of them, I'm sure they immediately think of some of the Taizé songs like Veni Sancte Spiritus or
Jesus Remember Me.
Jesus Remember Me. So many classics in our church today now. But not many people might actually know what Taizé is. Yes. So could you maybe offer a brief word for our audience?
Yes, I would be happy to do so, because I think in the United States we are associated mostly to music, whereas people don't always know that it's a community, it's a place. Taizé is first of all the name of the village where the community started in 1940. And it's become a place now where there are brothers from different traditions, Catholic, Protestant, living together as an ecumenical community. And then in the 60s, up to this day, it's become a place where young adults go. Older people go as well, but young adults come in large numbers. As we speak, there are 2,000 young people at Taizé for this holidays of All Saints in France. It's a special period of the year. And so we get about 6,000 young French people for those 2 weeks of holidays that French people get. But throughout the summer, there are about 2,000 every week. Spend a full week at Taizé. And so that's a chapter that no one would imagine. When Brother Roger, the founder of the Taizé community, started in France, he imagined a small community of brothers. He didn't imagine all these young people. And it's good to know that the music grew out of that presence of young people. We had to find ways of praying with them. They don't have a common language. That's how we started to develop these short songs. So the short songs were not just an idea that a musician had one day, it would be great to try this, but they were in response to a difficulty. We don't have a common language. We can't use many words. So our surprise was that the music spread, that people said that this is not only for your context, very international, but also today we find it difficult to pray with many words. We are often very tired at the end of the day. We have difficulty focusing, and to have just a few words, it helps us to, get in touch with God. We're not always focused, but you keep singing the same thing. It comes back at you, and maybe what you are singing gradually enters your heart.
Yeah, it reminds me very much of the repetition of the prayers, that is. It reminds me very much of traditions such as litanies or the rosary or the Jesus prayer, all these beautiful Christian traditions of just the repetition and the way it draws us into a mystery.
Yes. And beauty does that too. The fact that the songs are simple, but there's a beauty to them. They work musically. There are cantor parts, solo parts. And so beauty is disarming. Beauty is disarming, and many people today are afraid of God. They're afraid of a relationship with God. They're afraid they will lose their freedom. They will lose their freedom if they open up to God. And beauty disarms you. It takes away a lot of those fears. And I think that's why lots of young people were able to open up to God in Taizé and become Christians. It's because they lose all these shields that we protect ourselves with, and dare to open their hearts.
And Anthony and I are both so blessed because we both had the opportunity to briefly visit Taizé. But of course, we've prayed with the songs and the prayers of Taizé for years. And pertinent to our topic today on polarization, I think it's very much relevant to the history of Taizé, just because one of the core pillars of Taizé spirituality is reconciliation. I remember even the church being named the Church of Reconciliation.
That's right. No, you're right. I think we feel a kind of responsibility also at Taizé to make it a place where people from very different backgrounds can meet. And it happens every week. Right now I was telling you it's a time when lots of French people are there. So we have people from the suburbs of Paris, the poor suburbs, and we have people from the nicer parts of Paris. And sociologists tell us, you realize this never happens, no? You realize this never happens in real life, that people are together like that for meals, for a whole week. And I think it is part of our vocation to bring very diverse people together. So it happens also in terms of denomination. Also, you have many Catholics, of course, that come, but also you have Eastern Orthodox, you have different Protestant churches from Europe and other countries. Of course, when you think just in terms of labels, you maybe don't see how that's possible, but when you see real people, I personally like the expression that Brother Roger, our founder, and Brother Alois, who succeeded him as prior, the one in charge of the community, they use the expression, all those who love Christ. And it's a wonderful way of describing Christians also, all those who love Christ. And so when you start to think in those terms, then sometimes your way of seeing others changes. And there are, maybe politically also, there are people who will come to Taizé with very diverse backgrounds. They don't all have the same political options. We get lots of people today who are very concerned with the future of the planet, or ecological movements, but you get people from other backgrounds that have suffered from communism, that have been a huge number of people from Poland, from Hungary, from Romania, even from now it's less with the war, but from Russia, the Ukraine. We had Ukrainians all summer at Taizé.
Wow.
They came directly from countries at war, and they're suddenly there. And during the war in the Balkans, in what was once called Yugoslavia, we had Serbs and Croatians and Bosnians together. Very unusual, no?
Yeah.
Unusual. Not saying it works right away. Doesn't necessarily work right away. But sometimes when you're sitting in the church at Taizé, we don't have many pews, as you know, people sit on the carpet. And when you're sitting for 2 or 3 days beside someone you think is like you, you are Croatian, you imagine that this person must be, but he's actually a Serb. You've been praying for 3 days beside someone that you thought was an enemy. When we had our European meeting in Zagreb, European meetings are what we have after Christmas for 4 days, 5 days. Sometimes it's 30,000, 40,000, 50,000. We've had up to 100,000 young people who come from all over Europe. We have to provide accommodation. We have to provide meals for them. And some very courageous Serbs came from Serbia to be in Croatia, a country they were at war with Croatia just a few years earlier. And they thought, in any case, we're going to be staying in schools. That's going to be our accommodation. But they were staying in Croatian families. And they phoned their parents to let them know they had arrived safely. And the parents said, where are you staying? And they said, we're staying with a Croatian family. You must leave right away. You must leave right away. You're in danger. And they said, no, we're not in danger. There's a wonderful welcome here. They said, well, promise you will phone us every night to tell us you're still alive. No. And so they did. They phoned every night to say, we're still alive.
Wow.
It's still going well. And on the last evening, the parents said, can we speak to the parents that are welcoming you? And beautiful. That happens a lot at Taizé. It happens a lot at Taizé and in the European meetings, that people realize that we have so much prejudice, so our views. We don't really know people. We know about people. We know about what we read or heard here or there. But something happens when you get to know real people, real persons.
And when I think of Taizé and the sort of privileged position that you and the other brothers are in, where you get to see these things firsthand. Yeah. You can see the changes in people's hearts and people's minds.
True.
And also the struggles. I recall a few days ago you were sharing with us, Br.Emile, about just some recent pilgrims who came from the Middle East and just had their own internal wrestling with everything they were going through.
Yes, true. Yes, we had people from Gaza. We had a young woman in particular. I've known her for some years. She married a Frenchman, so she's safe and living in France, but her entire family's in Gaza. Lost everything. Wow. Lost everything. Some of her brothers and sisters had just purchased an apartment and it's completely destroyed. Her parents' home was destroyed. they're living in a church right now. They're living in a church, literally living in the church. And so this is a Christian woman. So she says, I pray every day that my heart not be filled with hatred.
Wow.
I pray every day. I don't want to be a person of hatred. It's not Christian. I pray every day. But she said, I don't always win the battle. I don't always win the battle. I try. I want to. I ask God's help, but I don't know. And conversely, we had an Israeli woman that I've known for some years. I go to Israel quite often, and she's Jewish. But she has many Christian friends. She has studied Christianity. She knows Christianity very well. She's considered a very excellent guide when you visit the holy sites in the Holy Land. And she said, I'm a friend of many of the families of the hostages that are being held. Some of them are close friends of mine.
Wow.
And but I force myself, she said, to listen to Al Jazeera News every night to find out what's happening in Gaza. And so both of these women were struggling to try to make room for the suffering of those on the other side. They didn't want to just see the suffering of their own people. But the suffering of their own people was so overwhelming sometimes that it seems almost superhuman, not to try to think about others, try to think about suffering on the other side. Some people have managed. You perhaps heard recently the case of Rachel Goldberg, Polin, who was the mother of Hirsch, one of the hostages that survived when he was kidnapped. He lost part of his arm, but he got good care right away, so he lived, but he was killed at the end of the summer. They found him dead, and this woman wrote this fabulous poem. I hope your listeners get a chance to listen to it. She starts off by saying, there is a lullaby that says that if you are the mother of a boy, by the time he is an adult, you will have cried millions of tears. And she said, I have cried millions of tears since the 7th of October, since the attack at Hamas on the kibbutz. But I think also of the suffering of that other woman over there, meaning Gaza.
Right.
I think, or Jewish woman. I think of the suffering of that. Because she said, she is so similar. We are all so similar. And is it possible to imagine that we plant a seed that is wrapped in fear and trauma, but also hope, and plant it? And maybe with all those millions of tears, if we remove the salt from them, water the desert of our despair with them, and see what grows.
Wow.
And it's a fabulous poem. And when they asked her, when they found her son dead, they said, have you lost your faith in God? She's a practicing Jewish person. And she said, no, I have not lost my faith in God, but I have lost my faith in some people that I believed would behave differently. And there's a difference now.
Yeah.
There's a difference between losing your faith in God and losing your faith in some people who disappoint you by their behavior. And so these stories are important because these are people who, in Israel, in Palestine right now, I think one of the most powerful groups is the Circle of Bereaved Parents. I don't know if you've ever heard of them or if your listeners have heard of them, but you can check their website out. It's a very unusual video that you see. A 2-minute video where everyone says the same sentence. One person says it in Hebrew, modern Hebrew, another person says it in Arabic, and the sentence is, we don't want you here. With very harsh faces, closed faces. We don't want you here. For 2 minutes you get this one sentence, and you only understand at the end what they're talking about. We don't want you to belong to the circle of bereaved parents. We don't want you to lose a child. Right. In this conflict. Right. That's why we are here, to prevent further deaths. So we don't want you here. Powerful. And when I was preparing a meeting in the Holy Land a couple of years ago with all the churches of Palestine and Israel, the Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Lutherans, the Anglicans, other smaller churches, I saw this man come in one of the preparation meetings. I sensed that this man was different. He was a school principal, but he came in with some Greek Orthodox. He was Greek Orthodox, came in with them. And I found out that he had lost his child in one of those shootings where Israeli army thought that his car was identical to the car that they had noticed they considered terrorists, and he was not part of that group, but he had the same car. So they shot his wife, they shot one of his children, and he immediately joined this circle of bereaved parents to work for peace. And I asked him if he would do a workshop during our gathering in the Holy Land in May 2022. We had several hundred people that came from Europe. He immediately accepted. And those are the people that inspire hope today.
And there's such an honesty in the stories. Like you can hear it when they say, I don't want to give room for hatred in my heart, but some days I don't succeed. Or when you hear, I haven't lost my faith in God, but maybe my faith in some people. It's like you hear there's a deep sincerity in that. There's like a truthfulness to the experience, the pain in their hearts.
Yes.
And I feel like that's so essential to really like go through the suffering and the grief.
Yeah.
Like how could you if you don't really look at reality in the face?
Yeah. I think you're very right. Yeah. It's you have to look it in the face sometimes. You have to look at the tragedy in the face, but then also see that we have to do something with these tragic events. We have to turn them towards life, as much as possible.
Yeah.
That's what these people have chosen to do.
And, in our culture or in our world today, like we're so desensitized to it. I'm sure you see it too, Anthony. Like there's so much tendency, or maybe even temptation is the word, to just turn away. Like not even for bad intentions, but like maybe like it's just too much for me to look at right now. It's too much for me to take in. And yet, in the same breath, like we find that the prejudices are deepening and the tensions are deepening, and I plant my feet in even further. Like I look at the violence, and on the one side, I can't look at it. It's too much for me. And at the very same time, I'm just like, how could those people do that?
Yeah,
how could those people do such a thing?
Yes.
How could they think that? How could they believe that?
Yeah.
So I don't know.
I can tell you maybe just one other story of the Middle East, because I went to Lebanon during the war in 1982. I went with Brother Roger, the founder of our community. There had been a large group from Lebanon that came to Taizé in 1974. 100 young Lebanese had come. And Brother Roger had always promised that he would go. But then the war broke out in 75, and it lasted 20 years. But in 1982, there was a moment, a few days of peace. The guns stopped, the shelling stopped. Brother Roger said, let's go to Lebanon. And he wanted in particular to see the mother of a young boy. His name was Hassibe Kirous. And then he had to go visit his family in the Bekaa Valley. It was quite dangerous to go there. There was a lot of fighting. And he thought, I might be killed. There's a chance that I will be killed. And so he left this letter to his family. If I am killed, I ask you one thing. Pray, 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 and forgive those who have killed me. And Brother Roger felt, for these countries where there's been so much killing and suffering and revenge, and that boy knew, that young man knew, there's a future if there's forgiveness. There's a future for our country if we are able to forgive, if we're able to go beyond the hurt that we have suffered. And so we went to see his mother. To see his mother, we found his mother in Beirut, and often I think of people like that who. We talked a little about during the weekend about imagination, the role of imagination, that people I think who study the Bible today, theologians, Bible scholars, are realizing that imagination plays a much bigger role than we thought in the past. The Bible is a lot in a poetic style. No, it's not so much definitions, but it's a lot of poetry. And so poetry speaks to our imagination. It gives us images, but it also stimulates us to think about what could be. And so Jesus does that in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, love your enemies. No, he says, it means you could imagine a different way of reacting to hostility.
Yeah. Not
necessarily by paying people back. You did this to me, I'll do that to you. But really going beyond the evil. No? And in a way, anticipating the end of evil. Already in your behavior today, you anticipate the end of the evil that separates you from your brother or sister. And so people are realizing that's a huge part of Scripture. Scripture speaks to our imagination to go beyond the first reaction. That is normal to us. We want, of course, when you are hurt, you want to hurt back. When someone of your family is hurt, you want to. But Mrs. Rachel Polin, who wrote the poem I mentioned earlier, the mother of the hostage, she was saying, we've seen that we're going nowhere with this. No, you hurt me, I hurt you back. You hurt me, I hurt you. And it's an endless thing. So at one point, there have to be people who stand up and saying, I will not continue this. This vicious circle, I will not continue the transmission of hatred. And those are the people who prepare a different world. We saw that after the Second World War in France. The Second World War in France, there was de Gaulle, the French president. There was in Germany Adenauer. And they believed that it was possible to think of a different future. They had fought in the First World War, they had fought in the Second War. In the 19th century, there were already wars in 1870. But suddenly some people say, we could imagine a different way of being. So that's how the European Union was created.
Right.
People with a vision. We need that today. We have to think of people who are different and even people who have hurt us.
Yeah.
That new chapters can be written. I often think that's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not saying, "Oh, it wasn't so bad after all," or what I labeled bad yesterday, I label it okay today. That's not forgiveness. No, but evil is evil. You have suffered something real. You have the right to be angry with something that you suffered about, but you can believe also that there can be new chapters. New chapters, and that's what forgiveness is really. No, it's releasing someone. You have the right to hold them as prisoners for the evil they have done, but you also have the power to release them. No? Jesus says that in the Gospels. No, what you forgive will be forgiven. You have that power to release, and so it's a wonderful responsibility, terrifying responsibility, but wonderful responsibility also.
Brother, you spoke I think beautifully, like how many times we, even in times of hatred, once we come to encounter the other, that becomes a place of helping us realize that there is more than what the ideas are.
Yes.
But many times we see people are very strongly held on to their ideas. They don't want to let go.
Yeah.
Is there anything that insight into that from your time? Because at Taizé you have, I presume, people who are with strong ideas, with strong
maybe beholden to an ideology even.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about it a little bit during the weekend about how realities are greater than ideas.
Well, I think the key word there would be experience. No, to provide people with an experience of a discussion or a friendship with someone else. No, so you can come to Taizé and be from a certain background and meet someone from a totally different background. You may have prejudice even towards that, and then you discover. But they also are praying, they also are searching, they also are good people. And suddenly you no longer have labels. You no longer have labels, but you have an experience to rely on. You say, sometimes that pushes you to even forget someone's color or background. I remember in Haiti, when I was in Haiti in 1983 with Brother Roger, we stayed in the big slum, Cité Soleil. That's the worst slum. I think you would agree, Anthony. No, it's the worst slum. And there was a priest there, Père Volel. Volel was his name. You would see him drive around in his truck. He was always helping people build their homes. He was on the ground helping them. He was the parish priest, but he was also very concretely serving the people. And the people there, of course, they were all black. No, they're Haitians. But they thought he was black. He was white. Mais non, le Père Volel n'est pas blanc. Le Père Volel is not white. He's one of us. No? And so you have an experience of someone who's in solidarity with you, and you no longer see color. You no longer see ethnic background. You no longer even maybe see religion. Sometimes you just see a good human being. And we have great people, of course, who in the 20th century and today also who can help us do that. I think there are examples of in our church history, even recently, Pope John the 23rd, who's a saint now in the Catholic Church. Pope John was like that. Well, the first time he met with the Jewish community after years and years of Christian anti-Semitism. The first time the Pope met with the Jewish community in Rome, he said, "I am Joseph, your brother." It was a very moving moment. Referring to Joseph in this book of Genesis, who became prime minister of Egypt and was able to rescue his brothers, and they didn't know it was him. They didn't know. And Joseph is so moved, he's weeping in secret, but then he finally says, "I am your brother." And suddenly that huge distance is vanishes, no, and they're truly brothers. And people have opened the way for that, but it's up to all of us also to see, how can I journey also to a place where I find the necessary peace inside, to be a person of peace, to be a person of communion. Labels are difficult. Labels are difficult because the people I think who have worked today with polarization realize that if things don't have labels, then people will come together and find common ground. When it's labeled, this belongs to one party, then people say, well, that's not my party, it's not my group. But if it's a cause, if it's for children, for example, children who are suffering, you'll get lots of people who will say, I want to help. They might be from different political parties, different churches, different religions even, but they want to be loving people, helping those who are suffering. And maybe that's what we have to try to help with, is to identify things that we all think are important, and think less in terms of labels, not position ourselves according to ideas that we have more or less understood, but maybe realize that we're meeting a real person and then take it from there, see what's possible from there.
And seeing that possibility, seeing or imagining, as you mentioned, imagining that there's more, imagining that there's a greater possibility than the reality that I seem to see in front of me. Something really, I think it came through just praying, and the whole spirituality of Taizé in my life was almost as a thought exercise, trying to find people that I strongly disagreed with, for instance, in like the political sphere or religious sphere or otherwise, and like trying to hold to like this I guess conviction that most people, most of the time, choose most of their actions because they really, if they don't think that what they're doing is the right thing, then they've at least justified it to themselves somehow. And like carrying that conviction, really, I noticed it very slowly but very radically changed the way that I looked at people that I found myself like disagreeing with. Because there's something that it's like the label can't hold any longer. It's like it can't bear the weight when you're going at it with the idea that like, no, this person is trying to act with good intention, like, and daring to imagine that. Like it does take a creativity, it does take an imagination, but like, I mean, I certainly feel the struggle of it. It feels burdensome.
People are more than labels, right? People are more than just the labels we put on them, or an ideology we put on them. I guess, sometimes though we can't go past that for some reason. And I think that's where I think we get stuck.
Yeah.
Like, this is who you are. And I think the encounters, the experiences are very important. Brother, is there anything else that you've seen?
Well, this year we took a lot of time at Taizé, reflecting on a text that your listeners can find on the Taizé website, www.taize.fr. A text called Journeying Together. Journeying Together. And it's a text written by our new prior, just started in December of 2023. And there's a part on listening. There's a part inviting all those who read the letter to learn how to listen. No? And in the context of polarization, that's very difficult. We may not agree with the ideas that we're hearing, but at least we can see where people are coming from.
Right.
No? Maybe they're coming from fear. I'm afraid of losing this. I'm very attached to this value in our society. No? I'm afraid we're losing that today. No? So maybe it's worth listening to that. Maybe we have something to listen to. You might not agree, you might think, but there are other values that are emerging that were not important before, no? That we consider important, and some people are more attached to those, and maybe listen to that side of things also. So everyone has something to share and to contribute in society. No? Everyone has something. We don't get the whole picture all alone. No, we need to listen to each other. And if we are good listeners, if we are patient, and if we believe that we all have something to contribute, then we can find common ground. I think that requires imagination as well.
Yeah,
it requires imagination, but we've seen it happen. We've in our big meetings when we work to house 100,000 people. We see all kinds of people collaborating that would never otherwise collaborate, and so there's surely ways of doing that in all kinds of areas today.
Yeah, it definitely it feels taxing.
Yeah.
It's imagining or daring to create a future with hope.
Yeah.
Dare to hope.
Daring to hope.
Yeah.
It's no, it feels like a toll. Like it takes real like mental, spiritual labor.
I think also we realize that what we're dealing with today is a lot of fear.
Yeah.
And so that is what the cause of a lot of polarization also. And if you realize that the real enemy is fear, maybe not selfishness, maybe there's less selfishness than we think in society. Even in circles that appear to be very harsh and closed to the suffering of others, those same people can sometimes be very generous if they are approached in the right way.
Yeah.
And Cardinal Czerny was telling us this, the cardinal who works very closely in Rome with Pope Francis. He himself was a refugee when he was a child. Communism came into Czechoslovakia.
Good friend of Bishop Juma as well.
Oh, he's okay. Yeah. So he left. He had to leave Czechoslovakia as a boy. His parents didn't want to live in a communist country. So they came to America. I think he lived both in the United States and Canada. He became a Canadian citizen. And we used to talk to him in Rome about the situation of the world and displaced people everywhere. And he said, you should do a week at Taizé on those questions. No? So we did. And he said, if you want, I'll come. And he came. I went to get him at the airport. And he said, some theoretical questions you'll get an answer that appears harsh and cruel and selfish. But the same people will answer another question with great generosity. Mm-hmm. And so interpreting one form of answer as selfishness is maybe not the correct way of doing things. So he gave the example of a theoretical question concerning migration. Do you think it's a good idea for our country to have more migrants? And lots of people will say no because they're worried. But the same people might say, for example, there are 2 young girls that just arrived yesterday from Syria. They have no place to sleep. Would you take them into your home for a month or 2? Those same people who said no to the theoretical question will say yes to offering hospitality in their home, which is much more taxing, right. Much more demanding. No? So is it right to think that they were being selfish when they answered the first question? No?
Or maybe it isn't even as taxing and demanding as we think.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't selfishness. Maybe it was fear of the unknown. We don't know certain cultures. We don't know certain religions. So we prefer to say no. But if we got to know them, it would be different. And so one of the things I feel our churches can do, our parishes, our churches, is to help us to know real people. Help us to know the stories of people who have arrived from difficult contexts. I know, for example, people who had to flee Syria, they had to flee ISIS. They had 1 hour. They were told ISIS is coming in an hour.
Wow.
So they had to flee for their life. They could take a small bag and run as fast as they could. No? And then they come to our European borders. And we say, you have nothing? How could we have anything? We had 1 hour to flee. No? So of course they're going to ask for some sort of solidarity, and we should be proud to provide that solidarity to people who have fled for their life. No, but once you get to know their story, what they've been through, you start not to think in terms of statistics and numbers and labels, but you see real people. No? And that's one of the challenges I think today, that we would come together much more on certain questions if we could listen to the real stories of people who have suffered a lot.
Right. I think it's very tempting when we're removed from these concrete realities to talk on the level of ideas, as I think you mentioned before, Anthony, to have some sort of abstracted, removed, objective debate. Yeah. And like on that level, like I can talk to people who think differently than me, and I feel very self-righteous in my anger. But it's like you said, brother, if it were, in the moment, if it was somebody at my door in need, starving, bleeding,
very different.
It's so different. It's so different. And that same polarization seems to not hold up.
Yeah, I think maybe just trying to understand also, sometimes if we bring up the topic of polarization and discussions or listening, there is a sense of we need to compromise, for us to make progress. But actually, like, it's actually more than that, right? Or it's not just compromise, or it is probably not even compromise. It's probably discovering together, you would say, or how would you?
Yes. I don't know if you noticed during our weekend, we can't show it here now on TV, but there was an icon in the church we prayed. It's called the icon.
We can put it up during the podcast.
The icon of mercy. It was made for Taizé. We asked an artist who was a monk to make this icon. So it shows the story of the Good Samaritan. Christ at the center of the icon, but if you look on the sides, you'll see the man going from Jerusalem to Jericho, attacked by robbers. He's left half dead on the roadside. There's a priest, there's a Levite that go by, don't stop. And then there's a Samaritan who stops and who puts the man on his horse, takes him to the inn, tells the innkeeper, take care of him, and if here's some money, I'll come back. If I need to pay more, let me know. And at the end of the icon, you see 3 people sitting in a semicircle. And the idea of the painter, this is where I want to connect with your idea, is that the image of God in us is restored when we love. That's when we become whole again. And we are broken people often. No, we want to love, but we are broken. But the image of God is restored in us when we love others. That's I think what we would like to go towards. No, it's not just ideas, as you were saying, or certain policy, but it's really to be in the image of God. No, to be able to practice love.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful, right? Because we even need a person who disagrees with us to love him, for us to come to know and the image of God in ourselves. I think encountering the others, creating experiences for that, listening to their stories can be powerful ways of overcoming that polarization, which is very much seen today in the church here in the US, but also
there was an example of that during the Second Vatican Council. No? There was the cardinal who was in charge of the doctrine of faith, who was one of the highest positions in the Vatican, and they say that he had as a motto "Semper idem," no? Always the same. I don't know if it's true that was his motto, but he was a good friend of our community. He was a good friend of Brother Roger, and he's the one who gave the imprimatur for the office of Taizé, for the prayer book of Taizé.
Wow!
And he had these very strong positions, but he said, "Pray for me. Pray for me. I don't want to be an obstacle to what the Holy Spirit is doing." And I always admired that those words of his. This is my character. This is my nature. I don't like change. But pray for me. I don't want to be an obstacle to what the Holy Spirit is doing and wishing to do in the church. Oh. You have people like that, no? You know that some things pertain to character, to personality, and we have to find ways to going beyond that, and from a very unexpected place.
One of the things that stands out to me is, of course, we all have the capacity for being people of division, but also people of reconciliation, like whatever our characteristics or personality traits. But it is more than just having a certain knack for getting along with people of different backgrounds or ideologies. Like, it's more than just a personality trait.
It's more than that, yes.
Right. It's like not just being comfortable with the unfamiliar, or it's certainly not being wishy-washy. Like, you could still have convictions. You can still hold to certain values and not compromise on truth. But like, the key is like to not compromise on people.
Yeah, and not compromise on fullness, I think, because if we are all in God's image, it means that we all have something to contribute.
Right.
So if we lose sight of that, then we become sectarian.
Right.
And
not Catholic.
Sectarian is the contrary to Catholic. Right. And so we don't want to become sectarian. We want to become more and more people of fullness. And so that, I think, that is what we call ecumenism. Really, John Paul II, Pope John Paul, Saint John Paul II used to call ecumenism. It's an exchange of gifts. It's not a compromise on truth. It's an exchange of gifts. We realize that certain things have been kept in a very beautiful way. In this church, for example, the Eastern Orthodox churches with their icons, the beautiful icons we were talking about a moment ago. We have them in the Catholic Church also, but not as much. Not as much. It's not as famous, not as renowned, not as popular. And so there's a lot to learn from that. The Catholic Eucharist, for example, is something that often Protestants will come to admire, that there's this beautiful faith in the real presence of Christ who gives himself in the Eucharist. And they didn't always, some Protestant churches had a sense of the real presence, but others didn't have that, and they admire that, how the Eucharist has always brought people together in the Catholic Church, or a source of unanimity in the Church. No, we ourselves as Catholics, we have also learned a lot about reading the Word of God. No? 60 years ago, if you saw someone walking with a Bible, you would say that person's Protestant. No? Who thinks that today?
Yeah.
Who thinks that you're Protestant because you have a Bible? Huh? That tradition has totally entered our practice today. We have our Bibles, we read our Bibles. No? And so it's an exchange of gifts. That's what Pope John Paul meant. Ecumenism is not a compromise. I'll let go of that if you let go of this. It's not a negotiation between diplomats. No? Yeah. But it's an exchange of gifts with the view to a greater fullness. No? Yeah. Fullness. That's a beautiful word that St. Paul uses, the fullness that is in Christ. Yeah. The body of Christ that requires that not everyone be the hand, not everyone be the ear, not everyone be the eye. That we have to each occupy the position that God has given us in the body. And we need the whole body. We need the whole body. And there are so many challenges today. How can we meet the challenges that the modern world is presenting to us if we are not together, if we don't have at our disposal all these gifts of God?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. I think that's exactly where, what this podcast is about how we can engage with the challenges of the world today. And I think you bring up a beautiful point with us about how we need each other for that, no matter where we are. And so what a beautiful way to maybe overcome the challenge of polarization, to imagine a world without polarization, where we...
And this was Pope Francis' great idea with the synod, the synod on synodality, which is a mouthful, synod on synodality. But actually you could translate it by the word together.
Right.
No? The Russians used to have a word for that in their creed. They sobornost. No? And Father Congar, who was this great theologian of Vatican II, Cardinal Congar, he said, maybe you could translate it togetherness. We need to be together. No? Mm-hmm. We need to be the realization we need to be together to be the Church. We need all the gifts, and that's what pushed us last year to have this project. At the synod last year, the Vatican asked the Taizé community if we could have a prayer with all the churches, and so we did that on St. Peter's Square. It was a marvelous moment.
Br.Emile, maybe just because you mentioned Yves Congar, who, as I understand, you knew personally. It also reminds me of another person you knew personally, Henri de Lubac, who is, of course, a very important theologian for the 20th century, and something that I feel might be relevant even to, in a sort of roundabout way, to what we're talking about, is de Lubac's Surnaturel, is where he talks about this idea that there's a longing in every heart for the Lord. Yes. I don't know if maybe you could speak about
That's true, yes. We were fortunate. I mean, I'm much too young to have been there in the early years with de Lubac, but Father de Lubac was a great friend of Brother Roger. Already in the 1940s, Brother Roger used to go see him in Lyon, which is not too far from Taizé. It's just an hour and a quarter from Taizé. And yes, he was this great theologian who wrote some of these great books. There's this great book which you mentioned, Surnaturel, which speaks of the fact that in every human being there is a kind of awareness that I am made for something more than material things. I'm made for God. We are made for God. That is already a gift that God gave us with creation. We are made for God. But I think Father de Lubac's one of his great contributions in the early 20th century was to help us go back to the writings of the early Christians.
Beautiful.
To see how they thought. That he was one of the founders of this series of books. Now there are 600, I think over 600 volumes. It's the writings of the early Christians. And the early Christians had this way of writing about faith, which was very poetic. It didn't have the pretense of capturing the mystery in a formula or a definition, but it suggested, again, we come back to the theme of imagination. The words could suggest something. And so Father de Lubac was very instrumental in helping that spread in the church. And he used to come to Taizé, and so Brother Roger met him many times during the Second Vatican Council. I happened to be there when he was made a cardinal in Rome in 1982, I think. And he had not seen Brother Roger since the council. And I remember him coming down the nave of St. Peter to get his hat, a cardinal hat. John Paul II was giving him his. And I remember the moment he spotted Brother Roger, there was this big smile that lit up his face.
Wow.
And then we went to his room. He was staying in Borgo Santo Spirito, where the Jesuits have their residence. And he talked with us for a long time. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go see him a few times in Paris, where he lived. And very recently for the beatification process. He started the beatification process. It started for Deribak, and we were asked to give our witness also of how he had helped us, because he had encouraged Taizé a lot. And Congar was one of those great French theologians, also Dominican, was very patient also. He wasn't patient by nature, but he was patient
by grace, maybe.
By grace, and because of his faith, he knew that in the church we have to be patient with one another. We have to be patient with one another, and so he was the great theologian. Probably no one knew more in what we call ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church. Probably no one knew more than him. And he knew that in order to be faithful to the oldest tradition of the church, we had to be open to reform. We had to be open. So all these ideas that today Pope Francis is presenting, they are actually rooted in the very ancient tradition of the church. And so Congar used to protest not because he was a liberal, but because our ancient tradition pushes us to do this. So it was a wonderful contribution.
You've written beautifully about tradition. And
yes, that's why I wanted to write in my book. I have a chapter on that, because he showed how tradition is not only faithfulness to the past. That's very important, to be faithful to the faith of the apostles. We don't invent our own faith.
Right.
But we are called also to be faithful to the future. And that's the title of my book, Faithful to the Future, because we are called to be faithful to the potential that the faith of the apostle contains for all times, not just for the first century or not just for the first 2 millennia of it, but for all times there is something that will always be new. The real novelty is Christ. Christ will always be new, always be surprising. The fullness of Christ will always surprise us, and so
make all things new.
Make all things new, and so it's we are witnesses to tradition when we help people see the newness of Christ.
Well, it's so funny because tradition has become a word that's been embedded in some of this sectarianism and polarization, even in the church and outside the church today. But it's funny, there seems to be something that was in almost like the zeitgeist of the 19th, 20th centuries, where the church, Catholic Church, and even outside the Catholic Church, like I'm thinking back as far as John Henry Newman, and probably even before, like there was this growing awareness of like, we need to get back to something here. We need to like get back to, not just back to the essentials for our own sakes, but for my brother's sake, who, maybe he's going off in some direction or she's going off in that direction. We need to come back to something common, something the same.
And Father Congar did some work to show how sometimes the political situation that the church is caught in the middle of, a revolution, for example, or a dictator like Napoleon, or sometimes that will affect the way the church functions. So if it's a revolution, for example, it's chaos. So the church has to affirm its authority very strongly to come out of the chaos. Right. And we take that exception maybe when there's a certain form of authoritarianism to be the norm. Right. To be the norm. That's how the church functions. Whereas actually, if you look at the early centuries, the church is much closer to what Pope Francis is saying about synod and synodality. That's how it functioned. Much more bishops were always wanting to listen. Their decision was their decision afterwards in the end, but they were keen on listening to what the people. So that's why listening has become an important word again in the Catholic Church. It's not a novelty. It goes back to the earliest tradition.
Shout out to Amoris Christi's book, The Art of Listening.
Right. Yes, you have written on that. You have written a book here.
Which Anthony was a big contributor to.
Yes.
One might say the main contributor.
Amoris Christi together, collaborative effort. But no, thank you so much, brother, for being with us. It's been such a joy to have you here for this weekend and just over this interview as well. I hope we continue to open our hearts to people for who they are.
Real people,
yes, and not just in ideas or reduce them to a label.
Because we will be surprised when we see Christ,
Yeah.
And he will say, whatever you did to the least of mine, you did to me. And there will be lots of surprises.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, brother.
Thank you, brother, for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the In Spirit podcast. In Spirit is an initiative of Amoris Christi, an apostolate dedicated to lay spiritual formation. For more information and to keep up to date, you can visit our website at amorischristi.org and follow us on social media.